All right, so we have a very full mailbag tonight. As I understand it, it's actually the largest mailbag that we've had over the course of the week. I think we've had many dozens of questions. I'm not sure exactly how many, but I was told that it is more than we've ever gotten before, and it's been increasing, so it's really good to see that level of participation. I've always considered audience feedback and making my journalism interactive and a dialogue rather than a monologue central to being able to do good journalism. So I'm really thrilled at the growth of the segment and what has become, I think, a very well-evolving Friday night episode that we do each week, where we have a communication with our audience, where we interact with them, and at the same time are able to expand the kinds of discussions that we have. All right, so to begin with, the first question, and there were several questions, obviously, of different kinds about what appears to be the ratification, both by Hamas and by Israel, of the ceasefire plan that was put together by Donald Trump, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner for the United States, in partnership with many Arab countries, including the close allies of Donald Trump in the Gulf state tyrannies like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Qatar, but also Jordan and Egypt and Turkey, and then ultimately was accepted by Hamas. Israel's role in the background with the United States was making sure they got as much as they possibly could from the deal. But it's very hard to try and create a judgment that overrides the judgment of the actual people who have been suffering the most over the last 2 years, which of course are the people of Gaza. And if they're out in the streets celebrating for understandable reasons that there's yet another possibility that the absolute nightmare, the atrocity, the genocide that has been imposed on them, while much of the world stood by and watched, and while our part of the world, the United States and the West, overtly and affirmatively supported it with money, paid for it if you're the United States, armed it, diplomatically protected it, it's of course very easy to understand their ecstasy. And while they're celebrating, it's very hard to say, oh no, their eruption of happiness should be tempered by a lot of concerns, because you don't want to replace your own judgment for theirs about these events. After all, it's their lives and their society that has been devastated. And of course, you're happy for them if it really results in an end. But that's the big question, is if this is really going to result in an end to their misery and suffering, particularly the most acute kind that they've faced. And there were a lot of questions along these lines. So here are a couple questions, just very representative of the many that we got on this question. First is from Kat Rika, and they ask, quote, this: is this new Israel-Gaza ceasefire plan just the beginning of the implementation of the Trump-Blair-Kushner Gaza-Lago plan? And of course, that's a reference to Donald Trump's vision that Jared Kushner actually expressed years earlier, that Gaza would make excellent beachfront property, that they could just bulldoze the whole thing and build big Trump towers and resorts, and basically turn it like into a Dubai, but a Dubai that much of the West owns, the Trump family owns, associates, in partnership with the very wealthy Persian Gulf dictators that have massive amounts of money and are trying to expand in all sorts of ways. And then Trump, until as recently as December and January and February, was reaffirming that that should be the vision of Gaza, is just kind of bulldozing everything that's there and replacing it with these glitzy casinos and hotels, and as he said, turning it into one of these kind of hot spots in the Middle East that the very, very wealthy people in the West love to go and use as a playground. And it was extremely difficult, to put it mildly, seeing that happening, because that would involve the forcible displacement of 2 million people who have not only generations worth of presence in that land, but going back thousands of years, there's religious connections, extremely felt cultural proximities to that land. And they weren't going to just give it up because they were given a check for $10,000, an invitation to go live in the West Bank or Jordan or Egypt, whose governments would not have accepted them anyway because they don't want to participate in the ethnic cleansing. So that was always kind of a pipe dream, but that was, I think, a very disturbing and destructive plan that Trump articulated, because it was interpreted by Netanyahu, rightfully so, as a green light to just flatten all of Gaza and take it over, with kind of images of Trump golf courses dancing in Trump's head. So that's a concern, that is this really just kind of a ruse still on the way to getting to this point? Is it just an attempt to give the Israelis kind of a breather so that world pressure that has really been intensifying and turning against Israel, public opinion turning against Israel, can just have some time to be distracted and refocused on other things, feeding them a sort of ruse of a peace plan, convincing them that this is actually the end, when in fact nothing of the sort is true. I say that not as an argument, but as a question that a lot of people have, and I think rightfully have, given not just past history of how Israel has treated and then violated ceasefires, but also the last time there was a ceasefire, the one that Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump engineered the day before that he took office, and what happened there. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. But there's also the second question. This is from Hope's Dreams, very optimistic sounding name, and it's this. Glenn, is Trump going to let Bibi go crazy once the hostages are back? I saw some people saying this is obviously what's going to happen. So is it that obvious? All right, so let's start with this. As I said, you can go back with Israel and Palestine always, decades, long decades, and find all sorts of historical analogies and clues as to what the two sides might do to how a certain conflict or attempted resolution of the conflict is likely to play out, given the complexities of their domestic politics and the different factions inside each who believe in different things. But I think by far the most relevant evidence of what is likely to happen with this ceasefire is what happened with the prior ceasefire that was also engineered by Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff. This one also had the added influence of Jared Kushner, make of that what you will. But this was also a peace treaty spearheaded by Donald Trump. Although this time it was a much more elaborate effort. The last one was kind of forcing the Israelis to accept it because Trump wanted quiet during his inauguration. He wanted to come into his presidency being able to focus on other things and just keep Israel and Gaza quiet for a while. But that too, that peace deal, that ceasefire deal, which was not entirely dissimilar to the one that we have now, was also presented as a huge foreign policy achievement for Donald Trump. That Joe Biden presided over that destruction of Gaza for a year and a half and made zero progress in bringing it to an end or even getting a meaningful substantive ceasefire. In fact, the Israelis often celebrated the fact that Biden was president because they said he put no pressure on them whatsoever. And then Trump, before he's even in office, it's announced the day before he's inaugurated, announces what is a real ceasefire agreement. That was when there were all those stories about Steve Witkoff kind of bullying and speaking very abrasively to the Israelis, telling him that he didn't care that Netanyahu wasn't working on the Sabbath, that he's going to show up for a meeting. Those kind of stories that were leaked, whether true or designed to create an impression, we'll likely never know. But that too led to a lot of people to be extremely hopeful that finally these atrocities were coming to an end because of a peace deal, a ceasefire deal. And I remember very well, although my skepticism was very high, I watched huge numbers of people in Gaza pour out into the streets and celebrate as any human beings would understandably do, because they thought that their year and months-long horror show, their terror of living every day with Israeli jets and every night flying over their tents, bombing indiscriminately, being shelled and massacred by the IDF, all of the horrors that we've documented for so long had finally come to an end. And maybe they were allowing their hopes to subordinate their rational perceptions of what was likely to happen. But I can even understand, even if they did think it was temporary, why they were so relieved and happy to have a temporary halt to this barrage of death and violence and atrocity surrounding them. And I think that's what you're seeing now. I doubt that people in Gaza trust Netanyahu or Trump or believe that there's some guarantee that the Israelis are going to stop all of their manipulation and bombing and harming of Gazans. They haven't stopped for 70 years. Why would they suddenly stop now? But you can understand their happiness. It is a real ceasefire. There likely will be a substantial amount of time at least where Israel is no longer bombing and attacking Gaza. And so there is a component of it that is genuinely real, at least the part that is a ceasefire, some sort of ceasefire. And that's what happened back in January of 2025 before Trump was inaugurated, and then afterwards as well. A lot of people were hoping and thought that that was going to be a real ceasefire. And you may recall that ceasefire, like the one that we have now, was a multi-stage ceasefire, wherein the first stage, the Gazans would release Israelis who are being held in Gaza, a certain number that they agreed to, in exchange for Palestinians who are being held in dungeons, many of them without charges of any kind. And there would be something like 800 of those released and 30 Israelis released from Gaza. And then after that, there was supposed to be a withdrawal of Israeli troops back to their borders, or at least from substantial amounts of Gaza, a massive and immediate opening up of the flow of humanitarian aid. And Israel was denying that they were blockading it, but then they agreed to allow it in, kind of contradicting that denial. And stage one happened. There was some exchange of hostages on both sides. And then after that, it went nowhere. It never got to stage two. Instead, Israel began resuming its bombing of Gaza, even worse than it had been doing so before that ceasefire was entered into. And anybody paying attention would have known that that was coming. And the reason was that when this ceasefire deal was announced back in January, which again is somewhat different than the one we have now, but similar in design and the multi-stages on which it depends, back then, Netanyahu was openly boasting in Hebrew in Israel that the whole thing was a joke, that they had no intention of ever proceeding beyond stage one, where they got the hostages back. And he kept assuring the right-wing factions of his government, who were infuriated at the idea that there might be an end to the war, and even sections of the media who are very hardline and hawkish on this war. No, don't worry, this is a fake deal. We're never going to agree to section 2. We're going to claim that Hamas violated it, and then we're just going to go back to bombing them. And that's exactly what happened. And a lot of people were optimistic about it and then realized, actually, it seems like the whole thing was kind of deceitful. Here from the BBC, January 18th. This is basically right as the deal was being announced. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his country is ready to resume the war against Hamas should talks fail for a second phase of the ceasefire. In a televised speech just hours before the Gaza ceasefire was due to start on Sunday, Netanyahu stressed that the ceasefire was, quote, temporary, and Israel reserved the right to resume strikes in Gaza, and that intention had the backing of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump to do so. So right at the start, this vaunted deal, and I praised Trump and Witkoff for engineering this deal because, again, I saw the Palestinians obviously wanted that, and I thought it was a good thing. But I immediately saw Netanyahu saying, not only is it basically optional if Israel complies, that once they get their hostages back, they're very likely to start rebombing Gaza as if nothing had happened, but that they fully had the option to rebomb Gaza, re-enter Gaza whenever they wanted. And according to Netanyahu, Trump himself was sort of whispering to him, look, we need this deal done, but if you really want to start bombing again, we'll never oppose you and we'll never impede you or criticize you for doing so. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Here from the Times of Israel, this is January 28th, so this is about 10 days after Trump and Witkoff announced the deal that they had engineered between Hamas and Israel. Quote, Netanyahu says that he has received assurances from Trump that the U.S. will back Israel in resuming the war if Hamas violates the terms of the ceasefire or stops negotiating in good faith regarding the terms of the second phase. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has suggested the premier has given him an assurance to resume fighting that isn't conditioned on whether Hamas violates the deal. In other words, of course, the argument was, look, we just signed this very big multi-stage ceasefire that's being depicted as finally an end to the war. And then, of course, Netanyahu is going to say, obviously, if Hamas doesn't follow through with its obligations, we reserve the right to then start bombing Hamas, to start re-entering Hamas as if nothing had happened. And, of course, Israel was going to always say that Hamas failed to comply with its obligations. And in case that implicit threat wasn't enough, Netanyahu made it explicit. He told Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others in the Israeli press that it doesn't matter what Hamas does. Even if Hamas complies fully with the subsequent stages of that ceasefire, that Israel's intention and plan is to get the hostages back and then immediately restart the war. And that's precisely what they did. Yeah, my tie's a little disorderly. I think Friday night, I never believed in casual Friday. When I was a lawyer, I hated how lawyers would be all, pent up with their suits and ties all week, and then suddenly, because they were told to, started wearing equally uncomfortable, if not more so, khakis and these like blue Oxford shirts buttoned up to the top. And that was supposed to be casual. So I decided to go with the Friday vibe by unbuttoning the button. But we'll fix that a little bit. But in any event, that's what happened. So you look at this and you say, why wouldn't the same thing happen now? It's all the same framework. The first stage is the exchange of hostages. Israel's going to get back all the hostages, living and dead. And the Gazans are going to get back all of their hostages, which is what those people are who are in these dungeons with no charges. Some of these people were charged and convicted of crimes in Israeli courts. Obviously, those are not models of due process for Palestinians, but others, in fact, thousands of them, are being tortured or being abused or being deprived of basic human rights, even though they've been charged with no crime, that they're in administrative detention is what Israel calls it, meaning they just grab whoever they want off the street, put them into these horrific dungeons. Many of them stay there. They come out very malnourished, very sick. Some of them actually die. So those are hostages too. So that part is likely to actually move forward. But the question is the same plan in Israel in effect? And does it have Trump's backing? That at some point, the plan is for Israel to declare that Hamas has violated the subsequent obligations and therefore restart the war and finish what Israel started and achieve the goal that Israeli officials, including Netanyahu, have been very open is their real goal, which is taking Gaza for itself, clearing out the people who are there. Essentially that Trump vision or some alternative vision that's even darker, where they ethnically cleanse all of Gaza. And anyone who claims that they're certain that this time Israel's going to adhere to the deal, this time there's more pressure because it involves all these other Arab countries in the region. Israel has shown that they don't care about world opinion. They don't care about international. They don't care about anything, which is why we are where we are. And every time people assume, no, that's the line that Netanyahu can't cross or won't cross, he proves everybody wrong and he just does it and knows there won't be any consequences, particularly as long as he has Donald Trump and the Trump movement and the American right on his side, which is in charge of Congress and in charge of the executive. And the question also is this time, is that something that Trump is going to be okay with? And you might say, look, Trump's really invested in the ceasefire. He sees this as part of his legacy, as part of his campaign to justify what he thinks should be the Nobel Prize for Peace that he won. And the Nobel Prize for Peace was announced today. Trump did win. We're going to get to that in a second. And Trump was angry about it, but in reality, all the things he thinks he should win for would be eligible for next year's award. And so you might say, no, Trump really wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He really wants to go down in history as the president that brought peace to the Middle East. But you have to assume that that means that if Netanyahu and the Israelis and all of their extremely powerful and influential supporters in the United States are pressuring Trump to allow the continuation of the war by concocting some excuse about Hamas or even by arguing that Hamas really did violate it, you'd have to believe that Trump is ready to defy them and say, no, we don't care. Even if you think it's in your vital security interest, we are not going to allow you to go back to war in Gaza. And I haven't seen Trump be willing to confront Netanyahu or Israel in anywhere near that level of resolution that would be necessary for that to happen. So I'm not claiming this war is going to restart. I'm just saying there's a very good chance that it will. Obviously, I hope that it doesn't for the sake of the Palestinian people and that they have some chance to rebuild some semblance of society and carry on with some remnant of a normal life. But I want to keep my hopes separate from my rational expectations and point out that there's every good reason to think that this is a ruse or something that's going to unravel. And it's not just because of what happened in the past, it's because of what key Israeli officials are saying right now. Here is Emmett Segal, who, according to Haaretz today, is Trump's favorite pundit. And he's actually a very conniving, kind of shrewd, smart Netanyahu supporter. He's a hardcore supporter of expanding this war. He wants to see it carried through. And he was on Israel's channel 12. It's a very mainstream but pro-war, pro-Netanyahu, anti-Palestinian network. And here's what he had to say when asked about the next stages of the ceasefire.
ברור לכולם, נכון? אין שלב ב', זה ברור לכולם, נכון? השלב ב', זאת אומרת, יכול להיות שהוא יהיה יום אחד, אין שלב
Let's
ב',
just
זה
go
ברור
back to
לכולם, נכון?
the start of that.
השלב ב', זאת אומרת, יכול להיות
I
שהוא
need to
יהיה
read
יום אחד.
the translation. He's speaking in Hebrew, obviously. All right, so this is what he says. Let's go.
אין שלב ב', זה ברור
There's
לכולם,
no phase
נכון?
one, that's clear for everybody, right? Phase two might happen someday, but it's unrelated to what has just been signed. The deal signed now is a hostage release deal. It doesn't imply anything about the future, theoretically. Fantasies could come true, Emiratis and allies dismantling, tunnels and international body formed, Tony Blair governing Gaza. All this could happen in theory, but it's not part of the current tactical negotiations. What we have now is a hostage deal. There's a ceasefire while talks continue in good faith. There's the question of who decides. I need to say that under Trump, Israel has previously said talks aren't genuine or productive, and then resumed fighting. At the end of the day, I don't think we'll see the IDF tanks rushing back into Gaza like what happened when the last two ceasefires ended. But the big question is, are we moving toward the Lebanese model, Israel mentioned? In other words, the IDF stays beyond the international borders and strikes from the air when it detects buildups or attempts to Israel that are obvious. We're talking about strengthening efforts like digging more tunnels or building more arms-producing factories. This is what Israel is aiming for. The reasonable assumption in Israel is that President Donald Trump will approve it. That's one point. The IDF will withdraw to the 53% line. It was 57 initially, then drop to 53% when the hostages will be freed. The talks after that are based on the principle of withdrawal for demilitarization and dismantling, because we all assume that Hamas won't disarm willingly. And the Emiratis and other international forces won't achieve this quickly. Regarding the hostages, you all admit that when I hear Israel says making peace with enemies, I smell Oslo in the air and the implications it carries. This isn't peace, and these are bitter enemies, still on their knees. So he's saying pretty much as outright as possible, like, look, I guess I can imagine a world, a very theoretical world, where the conditions for our agreeing to the ceasefire being extended are somehow met, because our war aims are exactly the same. Hamas has to disarm, not be part of the governance of Gaza, and we don't think that's going to happen. Hamas will never do that voluntarily. They have to be forced to do that. And he said, I guess there's a way, short of Israel restarting the war, to force Hamas to do that. Namely, the Emiratis come in and magically transform Gaza into some well-governed place, meaning governed under the dictates of Israel and at the whims of Netanyahu. Or maybe Tony Blair can kind of be this sort of old-fashioned colonial viceroy where he comes in and just starts governing and presiding over Gaza as its leader with some, very kind of obsequious Palestinian aides, and that'll take care of the problem. But he's saying, we don't believe any of that's going to happen. Certainly not in the near future. And so what he's saying is, and again, this is, according to Haaretz today, Netanyahu's favorite media pundit, the person who's very influential in the circles that influence Bolsonaro's politics. And he's being very open about the fact that, look, it's extremely likely that we're going to have to keep bombing Gaza because this doesn't achieve our goals. All it really is a deal for a hostage exchange. And while there's negotiations to try and make the rest of it concrete to actually end the war in some way that we accept, it's unlikely that's really going to happen. And he's saying we're probably going to go back to the war. And he's saying also that Donald Trump will support the restart of that war in the event Israel decides for itself that it wants to. And that is language extremely similar to what from the start the Israelis said about the last peace deal in January, which not only led to a restarting of the war in Gaza, but a significant escalation of it. And so, of course, as hopeful as I am that this really is an end to the war, that U.S. and international media can come in and document what I'm certain are the unknown depths and severity of the real atrocities of how many people are buried under rubble, of the kind of destruction to civilian infrastructure that the world really isn't convinced yet happened. Although I hope all that happens, I believe the Israelis when they're saying, don't get your hopes up that this war is over. All right, you know what it's time for? There's times for different things at different points of the day in different shows. There's times for different things. Right now is time for real talk. It's real talk time. And that means that I want to ask you this question. How much time do you spend every day on a web browser? Clicking around, searching, scrolling through endless tabs over and over. It's a lot, right? Well, there's a new AI-powered browser from Perplexity called Comet, and it completely changes how you interact with the web. Using Comet feels like having a personal assistant living right inside your browser. You just take this little personal assistant. You don't have to talk to them. You don't have to hear them all day. You just shrink them, put them right in your browser. It's one that can actually do things for you, not just give you answers, but literally click, type, scroll, and search, just like you would, getting tasks done in the background while you focus on other more pressing things. I've been trying it out since we talked to them, and here's what really impressed me. I had Comet, for example, one of the first things it did, I wanted to go out to dinner, so I had it find me a restaurant that fit my schedule, book the reservation. It even sent a calendar invite to remind me of where it was and at what time, all while I kept working on the important work of prepping for our show with my esteemed colleagues. All I had to do is mention a few things to it that I was craving and how far I wanted to drive and other types of preferences, and it just figured the rest out in the background. It can also shop for you, summarize articles, book travel, or even bulk unsubscribe from your spam. All you have to do is download Perplexity's new AI web browser, Comet, today by heading to pplx.ai/Glenn, and when you download, you'll get a free month of Rumble Premium as well. That's pplx.ai/Glenn. Take back your time online with Comet. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.